rolling through Matthew, and we are coming up on the end. We're in chapter 26, and this is the plot to kill Jesus and some of the events of the Last Supper. And so we're really getting into the home stretch here of the culminating event of the Gospels, which is Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection. One thing that is kind of stands out to me about Matthew's gospel, and it was pointed out, I listen to a podcast called Help Me Teach the Bible when I do this, and they were talking about Matthew in one of the episodes, and the gentleman that was speaking about it said that one of the key things about Matthew that really stands out is that how alone Jesus is, like how utterly abandoned and forsaken Jesus is in his death. And one of the other things that he says is he's talking about a commentary where it's like Matthew's just kind of insisting on the victory that happens when Jesus dies. So I think that's interesting. But we'll go ahead and jump in here. So we're in chapter 26 and verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the place of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." So again, there's this idea in Matthew of, there's a narrative by Josephus, who's a Jewish scribe, scholar, I'm not really sure what his role was, what his job title was, but he wrote a lot about John the Baptist's ministry and Jesus's ministry. And so when he's writing about John the Baptist's ministry, it was rough, man. There were a lot of people. This was not just like a little thing. There were a lot of people following John the Baptist. It wasn't just a few people in the woods. Like, this was a big deal. And there were mobs of people. So there were actually mobs of people following John the Baptist and Jesus around. So when they say, "Lest there be an uproar among the people," they're not saying like a little row. Like, they're scared. They're scared there's going to be an uprising, right? And as we see, Pontius Pilate later is also worried about an uprising, right? They're at an outpost. Outposts often would have, a certain number of troops, but most of the time you wouldn't have a one-for-one with the people. So if the people greatly outnumbered the Romans, that would be a big conflict. So there is a certain level of fear here. Even the rulers and leaders are doing this out of fear of what they're going to lose, but it's calculated decision. And they don't want to do it during the feast, right? So they're trying to do it by stealth. And it says they've already decided they want to kill him. I think that's interesting. One other thing about that is just popped into my head. So they want to kill him. They don't have a charge yet, right? They're just going to try to find a charge to put on Jesus. The one that they eventually do is blasphemy. They eventually find him guilty of blasphemy. So, verse 6, "Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. She poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, 'Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.'" So Jesus is anointed at Bethany. Now it's interesting to point out that in John's gospel, this happens in a different time, because it's talking about being in when Jesus was at Bethany, right? So this is an event that had already happened. But Matthew's putting that event here. So it's not happening chronologically in Matthew. He's doing it as a theme, right? He's showing that the plot to kill Jesus is happening, and then he's pointing to this event that had already happened that is reminding him of Jesus's anointing for burial. Another thing to point out, Simon the leper. So this is probably somebody that Jesus had healed, because lepers were not allowed to be around other people. So the fact that everybody was at his house, in the house of Simon the leper, shows that he was probably healed by Jesus. So this other thing that I'll point out here, which is, I think, pretty common thing that's pointed out with these verses, is that the disciples are indignant. They're saying, why waste all that perfume could have been, that ointment could have been sold for tons of money. This was a very expensive ointment, apparently. I think there are estimates it would have been worth like months worth of salary or a year's worth of salary. So it was quite a big gift. And in one of the Gospels, it says that Judas especially is upset because he kept the money, and he used to, take money from the purse. So, but he rebukes them. He says, you're always going to have the poor with you. You're always going to have opportunities to help the poor, but you're not always going to have opportunities to anoint me for burial. Like, this is a unique event. So there's that. I also think it's interesting that he says, truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. That's pretty cool. Verse 14, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. So Judas is going to betray Jesus. He's already made up his mind, right? And they're looking for a charge. Judas is looking for money. And so it's a match made in heaven, right? He sells himself out and decides to sell out Jesus as well. And he does it for 30 pieces of silver. Now, what's interesting is if you look into the 30 pieces of silver, it's actually restitution. In the Old Testament, it says that if you're responsible for the life of somebody's slave, if somebody's slave dies because of you, that you owe that person 30 pieces of silver as restitution. So it's an interesting parallel or association to make, and to equate Jesus's life with the worth of a slave. That's an interesting concept, like, no matter how you slice it, I think. So, in verse 17, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? He said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed him, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. They were very sorrowful and began to say to one another, is it I, Lord? He answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Judas, who would betray him, answered, is it I, Rabbi? He said to him, you have said so. So I think it's interesting because the you have said so, or I think that's what he says to Pontius Pilate as well. Yeah, Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And he says, you have said so. And so, is it I, Rabbi? Judas says, and he says, you have said so. So it's interesting that both times that he said that, it's led to kind of a guilty verdict. And another interesting thing here is, a lot of people ask, like, was Judas saved? Did God force him to do this? Did God, how did this disciple betray Jesus? And what does that even look like? And he says, isn't I Rabbi? And a lot of times the disciples call Jesus Lord, but there's no recorded instance in the Gospels of Judas calling Jesus Lord. He simply calls him Rabbi or teacher. And so I thought that was kind of interesting and stood out, this idea of Judas, right? Judas, that's something that I think about with Judas all the time, and his betrayal is, why? Why, obviously there's got to be a mechanism here that God put in place for this betrayal, but I think it's an important aspect of the story, actually, that there's a betrayal and that it's somebody who willingly and decidedly went and sold out their friend. I think that's another element here that happens in Matthew's gospel. It's another, well, not just Matthew's gospel, but that forsakenness and that abandonment by your friends. the people that you have called to something greater. And I think it also illustrates that some people, no matter how close they are to God's saving grace, and an example of that, just won't be saved. They choose not to. They choose to do the evil, wicked thing for whatever reason. So I think that's an interesting section. So that's all I have for today. I think this kind of picks up pretty fast. I mean, we're just the day or so before the crucifixion, and all that happens in that day and overnight is just crazy. And it takes out, like, it really slows down. We have 3 chapters over that time frame. So just really interesting how much detail they go into in the final day, a couple of days of Jesus's life. But that's all I have for now. I'll pick up back in chapter 26. Next up is the Lord's Prayer and Jesus foretelling Peter's denial. So we'll have that coming up. Like and subscribe to catch these videos as they come out. If have been following along, I really appreciate it. Put down below what you thought about this section, or something that something interesting you've learned about this section in the Bible, or something you'd like to know more about. Put it in the comments. Let's get a conversation started. But with that, I will catch you in the next video. All right, peace.